In the early morning hours of June 13, 2022, a quiet neighborhood in Dunkirk, Maryland, became the stage for an act of violence so devastating it would leave a lasting scar on everyone who heard the story. At just 20 years old, Tyree Tashawn Richardson stepped into a house on Lakeside Court, not knowing it would be the final moments of his life. He went there with a purpose, a simple hope, to see his ex-girlfriend, to try and mend a broken bond. But what awaited him behind those walls was not forgiveness or reconciliation. It was death. Inside that home, another man was present, 22-year-old Terrance Kenneth Yancey of Washington, D.C. What began as a tense confrontation soon escalated into unspeakable violence. Within minutes, the air inside that bedroom erupted with the deafening sound of gunfire. Yancey pulled the trigger again and again, not once, not twice, but at least 16 times, 16 rounds fired into a young man who had come there with hope in his heart. Tyree Richardson collapsed, struck multiple times, his life ending on the very floor where he had stood seeking peace. The violence was so overwhelming that even seasoned investigators were left stunned. It wasn't just the loss of a life, but the sheer brutality of how it happened. And as Richardson's body lay lifeless, Yancey fled into the night, leaving behind shock, grief, and the desperate cries of those who had just witnessed the horror unfold. What followed was a frantic manhunt. Police units and K-9 teams spread out through the community. Residents were urged to stay inside as the search for a dangerous man intensified. For hours, uncertainty gripped Dunkirk, and then within a day the pursuit came to a close. Hidden in a wooded area near Town Center Boulevard, Terrance Yancey was found and taken into custody. The arrest ended the immediate fear, but it did nothing to ease the heartbreak that had already taken hold. Over the months that followed, this tragedy moved from the quiet streets of Dunkirk into the spotlight of the courtroom. Prosecutors described Yancey's actions as reckless, deliberate, and fueled by rage. The defense attempted to soften the picture, offering their own version of events, but in the end, the jury saw the crime for what it was. In 2023, Terrance Kenneth Yancey was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter, multiple firearms violations, reckless endangerment, and destruction of evidence. On July 28, 2023, he was sentenced to 18 years in prison. By law, he must serve at least half of that time before even being considered for parole. For Tyree's family and friends, the verdict brought some measure of justice, but it could never bring back the young man they had lost. A life full of promise, cut down in a storm of bullets that no one would ever forget. In this episode, we'll take you through the haunting story of Tyree Richardson, the young life lost in a storm of bullets, and the trial that followed. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe, because if you're fascinated by true crime stories like this one, missing even a single episode could leave you in the dark about cases that shake our world to its core. Tyree Tashawn Richardson was only 20 years old when his life came to a violent end, but his story did not begin with tragedy. He was remembered by those closest to him as a young man with energy, dreams, and the desire to move forward in life. Friends described him as loyal and kind, someone who always tried to find the good in others. Family saw him as the kind of son, brother, and cousin who could brighten a room simply by walking into it. Like many his age, Tyrie was navigating relationships, figuring out his future, and trying to hold on to the connections that mattered most. One of those connections was with his ex-girlfriend, a young woman he still cared deeply about. Their relationship had ended, but to Tyrie it wasn't finished. He believed there was still hope, still something worth saving. And on the night of June 13, 2022, just after 3 o'clock in the morning, he walked into a house on Lakeside Court in Dunkirk, Maryland, holding on to that hope. The night was quiet, the neighborhood still asleep, but inside that house, tensions were about to rise to a level that no one could have predicted. What Tyrie may not have known was that another man was already inside the home. 22-year-old Terrance Kenneth Yancey had come from Washington, D.C. and found himself in the same space where Tyrie hoped to reconcile with his ex-girlfriend. The atmosphere was charged from the start. Words were exchanged, emotions were raw, and what began as a confrontation between two young men soon turned into something far darker. In the small confines of that bedroom, Yancey reached for a firearm. What happened next was sudden, violent, and irreversible. The trigger was pulled again and again until the sound of gunfire consumed the house. At least 16 shots rang out, echoing through the walls, shattering any chance of peace. Bullets tore through the room, striking Tyrie multiple times. The sheer number of rounds fired spoke to a level of rage and recklessness that stunned even investigators when they later processed the scene. Tyrie collapsed where he stood, fatally wounded. At just 20 years old, his life ended in an eruption of violence that no one present would ever forget. As Tyrie's body lay still, Yancey fled. He did not look back. He ran into the darkness, leaving behind chaos and devastation. The sound of gunfire had already drawn panic, and within minutes the house became a crime scene. Calls to 911 brought officers rushing to the quiet neighborhood, but it was too late to save Tyrie. With a dangerous man on the loose, police wasted no time launching a manhunt. K-9 units were deployed, patrols expanded, and residents were urged to remain indoors. Dunkirk, normally a place of calm, was gripped with fear. Every passing hour without capture heightened the tension. The search stretched into the next day until, finally, Yancey was located. Hidden in a wooded area near Town Center Boulevard, he was tracked down and arrested within 24 hours of the shooting. The immediate threat was over, but the pain for Tyrie's family and friends was only beginning. This was not just another case file for investigators. It was the story of a young man who went to see someone he loved and never came home. It was the story of a confrontation that escalated into a storm of bullets, leaving a community shaken and a family broken. And as the legal process unfolded, more questions would be raised about why it had to end this way, and what justice could ever mean in the face of such loss. When officers entered the home on Lakeside Court, the scene told its own story. Shell casings littered the bedroom floor, each one marking a shot fired from the weapon Terrance Kenneth Yancey carried. 16 times he pulled the trigger, and each round carried with it the finality of violence that could never be undone. Tyree Richardson had no chance of survival. The barrage was so overwhelming that investigators who arrived at the scene later admitted the sheer scale of it was shocking, even for those who had witnessed years of violent crime. As news spread across Dunkirk, the community was left in disbelief. This was not a city plagued by constant crime. Dunkirk was the kind of place where families felt secure, where the sound of gunfire was the last thing anyone expected to hear. Now, in the early morning hours of June 13, 2022, parents were pulling their children closer, and neighbors were locking their doors, waiting for answers. A young man was dead, and the person responsible had disappeared into the night. The manhunt began almost immediately. Law enforcement officers expanded their search perimeter, using K-9 units to trace Yancey's path as he fled from the scene. Every lead was followed, every tip examined. Helicopters circled above, their searchlights cutting through the darkness. For those living in the area, the sight was unsettling. Their quiet town had become the center of a desperate search for a killer on the run. Meanwhile, investigators worked to reconstruct what had happened inside that bedroom. They pieced together the timeline. Tyrie entering the house just after 3:30 a.m., the confrontation that followed, and the eruption of violence that left him lying motionless on the floor. Witnesses inside the home were interviewed. Accounts revealed that the meeting had not been planned as a violent encounter. Tyrie had gone there to see his ex-girlfriend, to talk, perhaps to mend what had been broken. But Yancey's presence and his decision to carry a firearm changed everything. By the afternoon of June 14th, less than 24 hours after the shooting, the manhunt came to an end. Officers located Yancey hiding in a wooded area near Town Center Boulevard. Exhausted, cornered, and with nowhere else to run, he was taken into custody. The arrest brought relief to a community that had spent a night in fear, but it could not erase what had already been lost. For Tyrie's family, the grief was immediate and crushing. They were faced with the reality that his laughter, his plans, and his presence had been stolen from them in a matter of seconds. Friends gathered to remember him, sharing stories of his kindness and the light he brought to their lives. But even in their memories, there was an unshakable question. Why did it have to end like this? Investigators prepared their case, gathering evidence from the scene, forensic reports, and witness testimonies. Each piece of information painted the same picture. A young man cut down in an act of reckless violence, and another young man now facing the weight of justice. The stage was set for a trial that would reveal not only the details of that night, but also the consequences of choices that could never be undone. Would you like me to move next into the investigation and courtroom sequence at this same length and tone, keeping it strictly narrator style, or should I keep extending the aftermath of the manhunt first before the trial? With the arrest of Terrance Kenneth Yancey, investigators shifted their focus from pursuit to prosecution. What had begun as a frantic manhunt now moved into the meticulous process of building a case strong enough to hold in court. Every detail mattered. Detectives combed through the home on Lakeside Court, photographing the bullet casings, marking the trajectory of each round, and carefully documenting the scene where Tyree Richardson's life ended. The number of shots fired alone told prosecutors what kind of case they would be arguing. 16 trigger pulls, not a single round in desperation, but a sequence that demonstrated intent, control, and disregard for life. Forensic specialists examined the weapon, the bullets, and the wounds that Tyrie sustained. Each report confirmed the overwhelming force of the attack. Autopsy results painted a grim picture of a young man's final moments, riddled with injuries that left no chance of survival. These findings would later be presented to the jury, each detail reinforcing the gravity of what had occurred in that small bedroom. Interviews with witnesses provided additional insight. Tyree's ex-girlfriend, who had been at the center of the confrontation, recounted the events leading up to the shooting. Her testimony placed both men in the room, tensions rising until Yancey pulled the gun. Others inside the house described the chaos that erupted after the gunfire, the screams, the rush to call for help, the fear as Yancey fled into the night. These voices gave the case not just evidence, but human weight, showing the court the trauma left in the wake of those 16 shots. Meanwhile, the community of Dunkirk was still grappling with what had happened. Local residents, unaccustomed to violence of this magnitude, expressed shock in interviews with reporters. Candlelight vigils were held in memory of Tyrie, neighbors coming together to honor his life and to support his grieving family. The question lingered in conversations across the county. How could something so brutal happen here, in a place people thought of as safe? As the trial date approached in 2023, anticipation grew. Prosecutors announced the charges against Yancey: voluntary manslaughter, multiple firearms violations, reckless endangerment, and destruction of evidence. Each charge reflected a piece of the night's events, from the fatal shooting to his decision to discard or attempt to conceal what linked him to the crime. The weight of these accusations meant that the courtroom would become the next battleground, a place where the facts of June 13th would be revisited in painful detail. When the trial opened, the atmosphere was heavy. Tyrie's family sat in the gallery, faces marked with grief but also determination to see justice done. On the opposite side, Yancey faced the court, his future hanging in the balance. Prosecutors laid out their case with precision, using the forensic evidence, witness testimony, and the sheer number of shots fired to argue that this was not an accident nor a momentary lapse. It was an act of violence carried out with devastating impact. The defense countered, suggesting that circumstances were more complex, attempting to cast doubt on the portrayal of Yancey's actions. But the jury listened closely, weighing each statement, each piece of evidence, each photograph from the crime scene. After days of testimony, the facts spoke louder than arguments. The verdict delivered in Calvert County was clear. Yancey was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter, guilty of firearms violations, guilty of reckless endangerment, and guilty of destroying evidence. The courtroom was silent as the decision was read. For Tyrie's family, it was a moment of bittersweet relief, justice in the legal sense, but no true healing for the life taken. On July 28, 2023, sentencing was handed down. Yancey was ordered to serve 18 years in prison. By law, he would serve at least half before any possibility of parole. For some, the sentence felt like accountability. For others, No number of years behind bars could equal the value of Tyree Richardson's life. The story of that night had now reached its legal conclusion, but the emotional impact would stretch far beyond the courtroom. For those who loved Tyree, the pain remained, a reminder of a young life cut short, and of how quickly one decision can leave devastation in its path. With the trial concluded and the sentence delivered, the story of Tyree Richardson's death did not fade from memory. For his family, the verdict offered only partial closure. They had sat through every day of testimony, listening as the final moments of their loved one's life were described in painful detail. They heard the number of shots, the trajectory of bullets, the forensic evidence that reduced Tyree's humanity to diagrams and reports. And when the jury declared Terrance Kenneth Yancey guilty, they did not celebrate. Instead, they wept. Because no matter the sentence, no matter the years assigned by a judge, their son and brother would never walk through the door again. In the weeks after sentencing, the community of Dunkirk reflected on what had happened in their midst. Neighbors who once described their streets as quiet and safe now admitted that the gunfire on Lakeside Court had changed how they felt when night fell. Parents became more cautious, warning their children about late-night outings. Conversations in schools and workplaces circled back to the same tragic theme: how quickly an argument, a relationship, or a moment of anger could escalate into permanent loss. For law enforcement, the case stood as an example of both the challenges and successes of their work. The speed with which Yancey was tracked down demonstrated coordination and persistence. Yet the haunting image of a 20-year-old riddled with bullets also highlighted the destructive power of firearms in the hands of someone willing to use them without restraint. Detectives who worked the scene carried those images with them, reminders of the violence they are called to investigate and the families they are left to console. For Tyree's friends, the pain was sharper and more personal. They shared memories online, posting photographs of happier times, smiling faces that now carried a shadow of tragedy. Some expressed anger at the sentence, believing 18 years could never match the value of Tyree's life. Others turned inward, struggling with grief and the reality that the friend they expected to see at future gatherings, birthdays, and milestones was gone forever. Yancey himself entered the prison system to begin serving his sentence. By law, he would be required to serve at least 9 years before parole could even be considered. For the community, his absence meant safety restored, but also questions unanswered. Why had he carried a firearm into that bedroom? Why had 16 rounds been unleashed on a young man seeking reconciliation? The trial had delivered a legal conclusion, but motives, emotions, and the true reasons for that level of violence remained open wounds. As time passed, the case left ripples beyond the courtroom. Local officials and community leaders spoke about the broader issue of gun violence, using Tyree's story as an example of how quickly lives can be destroyed. Churches and community centers held discussions about conflict, relationships, and choices that can turn deadly when fueled by rage. Tyree's name was spoken not only in grief, but also as a warning to others about the consequences of violence. For his family, the struggle to live without him continued. Birthdays became memorials, holidays carried a chair left empty. They remembered him not as the victim described in court, but as the young man who had dreams, who wanted love, who deserved a future. And with every remembrance they held on to the hope that his story, though marked by tragedy, might keep another family from experiencing the same loss. The case of Tyree Richardson and the conviction of Terrance Kenneth Yancey became more than a headline. It became a reminder etched into the collective memory of Dunkirk that even in the quietest of towns, tragedy can strike, leaving behind scars that time alone cannot heal. As months rolled on after the sentencing, the story of Tyree Richardson's death continued to echo through the town of Dunkirk. For many, it wasn't just another case that came and went through the courts. It was a scar that lingered in the community's collective memory. Every corner of Lakeside Court still carried whispers of that tragic night. Neighbors remembered the sound of gunshots, the flashing police lights, and the sight of investigators moving in and out of the residence long after midnight. Tyree's family found themselves stuck between grief and resilience. They tried to move forward, yet each day reminded them of what they had lost. His mother described the pain as a silence that screams, because the absence of Tyree's laughter and presence was louder than any noise. They had endured the trial, listened to the evidence, and watched as the man responsible for his death was led away in handcuffs. Still, justice felt incomplete. A sentence, no matter how long, could never restore a life so violently taken. Meanwhile, Terrance Kenneth Yancey adjusted to life behind prison walls. His sentencing to 18 years carried weight, but in reality, parole eligibility after 9 years left many unsettled. For Tyree's family and friends, 9 years felt like a blink compared to the eternity they now faced without him. They worried about the day he might walk free, while Tyree would remain forever buried, his dreams cut short before they could be realized. In the community, conversations about gun violence and impulsive rage gained urgency. Local leaders spoke openly about the case, using it as an example of how unresolved conflicts could spiral into irreversible tragedy. Churches organized vigils, not only to honor Tyree, but to remind young people of the dangers that come with heated arguments, weapons, and unchecked anger. The message was clear. One moment of rage can destroy multiple lives. Tyree's friends struggled in their own ways. Some turned to social media, keeping his memory alive with tributes, photos, and stories that painted him as more than a victim. He was remembered as someone who loved music, who had ambitions for his future, and who carried a presence that drew people to him. Others admitted that the tragedy changed them permanently, making them wary, cautious, and skeptical of the relationships around them. Trust, once broken by violence, was not easily rebuilt. Detectives who had worked the case carried it with them as well. To them, it wasn't just another file closed. It was a reminder of the grim reality they faced daily, that human lives can be lost in seconds, and that their work, though critical, often came after the damage was already done. They had pieced together evidence, ballistics, witness testimonies, forensic reports, but even with a conviction, the haunting question remained: why so much violence, and why so young? And that question became the lasting legacy of the tragedy. Tyree's death was not just about one man pulling a trigger, but about what happens when anger, jealousy, and fear are allowed to escalate unchecked. The trial may have ended with a verdict, but the story remained unfinished in the hearts of those left behind. For Tyree's family, each passing year became both a memorial and a battle against forgetting. They chose to speak his name, to keep his memory alive, not as the boy defined by how he died, but as the young man remembered for how he lived. The case of Tyree Richardson and the conviction of Terrance Yancey thus stands as a dark chapter in Dunkirk's history, a reminder of the fragility of life, the permanence of loss, and the sobering reality that justice, even when served, can never undo the devastation left behind.